At high noon today, Charlie Baker became the 72nd governor of the Commonwealth. He took the oath of office in the House chamber, and after some congratulatory glad-handing with the assembled officials, Governor Baker got down to business, laying out a vision for how he plans to govern. When it came to tone, Charlie Baker's inaugural address was a bit of a compromise. At times, the new governor seemed to be channeling the together we can approach of his predecessor, Deval Patrick.
We must have courage to set partisanship aside and embrace the best ideas and solutions, no matter which side of the aisle they come from.
That urge to find common ground was reflected in some of the policy priorities Baker outlined, including fighting the surge in opiate abuse.
It is a crisis. It's one that cuts across every community in the Commonwealth.
But if parts of the speech were bipartisan, others were less so. At one point, Baker suggested that opposing an increase in charter schools would be unethical.
It's wrong for any of us to stand on a front porch or in a city neighborhood sympathizing with a mom or a dad when they tell us their child's not getting the education to succeed in life that they deserve, and then oppose lifting the charter school cap.
And when he spoke about the massive budget shortfall his administration is inheriting, Baker made his fiscal conservatism clear.
We can't blame this deficit on a lack of revenue. We have to recognize that this is a spending problem. We will hold the line on taxes. We're already demanding enough from our hardworking people.
But Baker was also self-deprecating.
We said we were chasing 100% of the vote. Based on the results this morning, we clearly didn't get it.
And he wore his social liberalism proudly.
And we've led the way for this nation on issues ranging from health care reform to marriage equality.
Now it's Governor Baker's turn to try to make history. So how was Charlie Baker's inaugural address received? WGBH News senior reporter Philip Martin was there, and he joins me now. Philip, good to see you.
Good to see you, Adam.
So you were in the hall for this address, right?
That's right?
What was the feeling?
Well, as you can imagine, I mean, this was, many of his supporters were there. They filled the rafters. They were hundreds of people outside. Many of the Democratic representatives and senators who were there were cheering for Charlie Baker, wanting to see him succeed. So he got thunderous applause as he entered the room. He was well received by people outside who weren't able to get into the Great Hall, and by people inside. So he was being received by officials and by, if you will, the grassroots. And the best,
even on a day like today.
Even on a day like today,
cold.
where he was supposed to walk down Beacon Street. I'm glad he didn't, because I would have been there with him. And it's much too cold for that. But all of this took place within the State House, and all along the way, he seemed to be well received.
Let me bring another voice into our conversation. Erin O'Brien chairs the political science department at UMass Boston, and she writes for the blog Mass Politics Profs at WGBHnews.org. Erin, thanks for being here.
Thrilled to be here.
What was your take on Baker's speech today as a piece of political rhetoric?
Well, Charlie Baker didn't get elected because he's a great orator, and that's fine, right? I think what you saw here, he ran as a public manager, and that speech reflects that. It was about efficiency. It was about entrepreneurship. It was about transparency, accountability. Those aren't lofty sort of things, but they're things that got him elected. So I don't think he tried to shoot for, we're going to be talking about this in 10 years. But what he did do is make a contrast from the Deval Patrick years. This is consumer-driven government.
At one point, he touched on Ferguson and the events in New York with the death of Eric Garner, and had a sort of an interesting take on what is behind the unrest that we've seen in Ferguson and New York, and the frustration that manifested itself in both those cases. Let's take a listen to what the governor had to say.
The tragic events in Ferguson and New York speak loudly, and their message is a simple one. When people lose hope, bad things happen.
What did you two think of that? That made me raise an eyebrow. I wasn't entirely sure that was the message or the lesson from those two events.
It raised a lot of eyebrows. I spoke to State Representative Russell Holmes, for example. He was absolutely befuddled.
Where's he from?
From Mattapan. Okay. He was trying to figure out what was being said. Spoke to a number of people who seemed very confused by what the governor was saying. But here's what I think he was saying. I think that I'm going to go on a limb here for a bit, because I think he wasn't simply talking about Ferguson or New York simply as those events that occurred.
Not necessarily just the killing of Michael Brown.
Not just the killing of Michael Brown.
The death of Eric
That's
Garner.
right. I think he was using it metaphorically to talk. Ferguson has become like Selma in some ways in terms of a place of reference, but also something broader, bigger. In this case, I think he was talking about disparity, the way some communities are perceived. In this case, African American communities are perceived by police officers. I think he was saying that there is that without some type of cohesive coming together, without some type of collaboration between communities, and the acceptance of these communities as equal, that is to say African American communities, and in Ferguson or New York, that it is problematic in terms of, in other words, I think he was saying if you are treated badly, you lose hope. That's my interpretation.
Right. And Aaron, that does seem to be something that he's sort of been eager to remedy throughout the campaign. I mean, he seems to be genuinely interested in the plight of inner cities.
Indeed, though he's relying on what we would call cultural explanations, right? Like individuals need to change. He didn't talk about structural inequality. He talked about hope, which isn't a bad thing, but that's a very typical difference there. And I think he chose to focus on communities of color because as a Republican and a blue state, we didn't expect to hear that. So he was trying to be a little bit different, but it did strike me as weird, especially the placement at the beginning as he tied Ferguson to police officers and the like there.
Well, remind us, because he didn't, as I recall, make an explicit connection between police officers and Ferguson, but he singled out public safety officers early in his speech.
And he did it very early. And that, to me, was one of the most striking elements of the speech, because I think a lot of politicians are running scared. When they see what happened to de Blasio and the way cops have
Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York.
The mayor of New York, have turned away from him, I think Charlie Baker was making, I'm going to talk about Ferguson later, but cops, I'm in your corner first.
And I think it's also true that when individuals don't want to talk, especially politicians, don't want to talk about structural problems, they do use as a substitute hope in poetry. The loftiness of words become a substitute for really exploring structural problems. And that is not, again, that happens to be his style, because I don't think he's really dealt with the structural issues that impact communities.
Are you too really confident, though, that he is not interested in structural problems in the inner city? Because it seemed to me that during his speech he said, he cited some examples of successful entrepreneurship in inner city, heavily minority communities, and said, we know what the solutions are, but government has not allowed people to implement these solutions on a wide scale. So I'm not as convinced as you are that he's not interested in the structural
I think even there, though, that's relying on individuals. I think he's relied on some strong individuals like Robert Lewis Jr., who I spoke with, who is an African-American in Dorchester, who runs a program, a very successful program, the base for youth. And again, the focus there is on young people, it's on individual achievement. If you have the type of educational tools, it's assumed that you can make it. But I think sometimes of course, misses larger structural issues. But at the same time, I think it is to be commended that he, in fact, has made these types of outreach, I should say, to communities that have been neglected.
Aaron, hold that thought. Oh, go ahead, actually.
Sure. He also brought up homelessness, and he brought up drug addiction. So he brought up social policy issues that a lot of Republicans, more mainline Republicans, wouldn't.
He's been talking about homelessness since early in the campaign. So, Aaron, what was your take on his invocation of Mayor Tom Menino, whose widow Angela was in the audience today? He said something at one point I found fascinating. He said, Tom Menino taught us that basic services matter. And among other things, the lesson from that is that if thousands of people are being driven crazy by the health connector because it doesn't work, we're not doing our job right.
Or long lines at the DMV.
Or long lines at the DMV. Why did he bring up Tom Menino the way he did?
Because Menino is loved in that chamber, and he's loved in Boston, and I would say beloved in Massachusetts. So I thought it was incredibly smart to use his legacy and then pivot towards new public management. We're going to be an efficient government. We're going to be transparent. We're not going to do sort of Deval Patrick social citizenship and government empowers. But it's when you go to government, it's going to serve you quickly. You're a consumer. So it was tapping into Menino's legacy and then using that legacy to pivot to something that's a little bit different, or a lot bit different than what's been going on with Deval Patrick.
I think we should also point out he also gave a shout out, if you will, to Cellucci, to former Governor Cellucci. And his memory was
whose wife was there.
His wife was there, and his memory, and this was true for Lieutenant Governor Polito as well, who worked, of course, under Cellucci, and they gave they made a tribute to Cellucci that was well received throughout the audience, and I think that, in other words, there's a legacy there that this governor believes he has to inherit.
There were some Republican grandees, national Republican figures of note in the audience, and one of them was former Governor Mitt Romney. Philip, I know you actually spoke with the former governor briefly about Charlie Baker. Let's hear what he had to say.
He spoke about the need for equal opportunity in education, and really it was about extending hope to all people in the Commonwealth. There's so many that feel left behind, that don't have hope.
So maybe a little bit of a dig there at outgoing former Governor Deval Patrick. What do you think about Governor Baker's balancing act moving forward? Like politicians on both sides of the aisle, he now has to try to govern from the center while pleasing the more conservative elements of his own party. Is that going to be challenging for him to satisfy both, moderate Democrats and Mitt Romney fans here in Massachusetts?
I think he's off on a good start. Put it that way. I think he has a template that seems to be working, at least from obviously he's on a honeymoon, and this honeymoon will extend for another 2 or 3 months. But I think he's very serious about trying to balance these forces. I spoke to Speaker DeLeo, who seemed to be very receptive,
very excited about it.
Very excited about.
Aaron, do you agree?
Where are they going to go? Where's the far right going to go in Massachusetts? So I think Charlie Baker has been incredibly adept by appointing a cabinet that has 2 Republicans, 3 women, 1 individual of color, and he's governing from the moderate middle, because the right has nowhere to go. He's governing, I think, thus far as somebody who's running again and wants to make a home in the governor's, well, not mansion, but on Beacon Hill in the governor's office.
All right, Aaron O'Brien, Philip Martin, thank you both.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.